Hey, everybody. Today I'm going to interview Dr. James Croft, and we are going to talk about humanism and religion. I'm very excited for this discussion. All right, James, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. I'm James. I know Jason because I used to work at a congregation called the Ethical Society of St. Louis, which is one of the very few big, successful humanist congregations anywhere in the world. And recently, I just started a new job as the university chaplain and lead faith advisor at the University of Sussex, which is a university on the south coast of England, right on the edge of the island there. And that makes me the first humanist to lead a university chaplaincy in the UK. So trying to blaze a new trail wherever I go.
That's amazing. That's great.
Well, it is weird to me. I mean, I'm kind of still a little surprised that they went ahead with it. I was pretty certain when I applied initially that there was very little chance of being hired for a university chaplaincy role in the UK because almost all the professional positions in that line of work are held by Christians and mainly Church of England Christians. And so I was really surprised and very grateful that they foolishly decided to hire me.
No, I know that they made a very wise decision, but I think that what you just said is a good segue to the question that I had, which is, what is humanism? Like, how would you describe humanism to a person who has never heard of that term before?
Okay, I'm going to answer your question in at least a couple of ways. But first, I just want to make a note about the question because I think that sometimes people ask that question and then the answers they get are more vague than they expect. And they think, well, why can't people just define what humanism is? If you think of that question as something equivalent to what is Judaism or what is Christianity, right? That's actually a big question. And it would be very difficult for any members of those traditions to really adequately define them in a short way. But I'm going to try. So I think of humanism as a tradition of thought and practice that is dedicated to three central values: compassion, the idea that all people are equal in dignity and that we need to create a world in which that dignity is respected; reason, the idea that human beings using our own intellect can solve the problems that we face. We don't need to rely on tradition or revealed wisdom or some sort of connection with the divine; and hope, which is the sense not that everything will necessarily get better, but that human beings can, working together, make the future better than the past. So, reason, compassion, and hope are the three core values of humanism. And humanism is a tradition of thought and practice based around elevating those values. That is how I would describe it.
That's a very good description. Okay.
I'm a
S-
professional.
So let's say the other person who's never heard of humanism before, they say, okay, yeah, every person has equal dignity, makes sense, sounds good. We can use our reason to solve issues. That sounds good as well. And also hope, like it sounds an optimistic kind of way of thinking. That sounds good. So in regards to the second part, does it necessarily mean that you have to be secular in order to be a humanist?
I knew you were going to ask that question.
Oh,
My feelings on that have changed over time. If you asked me that question maybe 15 years ago, I would have said yes, right? That humanism is a non religious life stance or philosophy. And that's how almost everybody thinks of it. So, broadly speaking, you ask a humanist, you're going to say, yes, basically, that entails being not religious or not believing in God. Particularly, sometimes it's expressed as a commitment to naturalism. I don't believe that anymore. I'm not sure if I'm going to get excommunicated from humanist circles anymore. I actually think that there probably are coherent theistic humanisms and religious humanisms. I think that if you are genuinely committed to the equal dignity and worth of all people, if you are genuinely seeking after the truth using human intellect and you're never willing to say this is true because X special person says it's true or because of some sort of revelation that's peculiar to me, but if you're engaged in the intellectual conversation of humankind and your ideas are responsive to others' reasons and you are constantly reevaluating your own reasons for believing things, and you believe in the capability of human beings to change our fate, which it rules out a lot of theists, right? You have to be not committed to a rigid teleology, an idea that there's a plan for the universe that is necessarily moving towards, right? So that's kind of an area which cuts out some theists. But I actually think that you can be committed to those values and believe in God or be a member of a traditional religion, and whether they would call themselves humanists or not, I would consider those people to be close enough. And
Yeah.
one of the reasons why I feel that is partly because of my experience doing a lot of interfaith activism with people who do not agree with me about God and religion, but who feel to me like they're involved in the same grand project of humanizing the world, right? Of
Yeah.
creating a more just and ethical world. And so I feel a kinship with those people. And also on the other side, because there are an awful lot of non-religious people who don't share my values at all, right? There are people who are secular but very dogmatic. There are people who are secular but hold political values that I think demean particular groups of people. So I think that for me, the most important thing is that you get to those positive values. How you reason your way to them, or what cultural or religious resources you use to underpin them, has become less central for me in my own understanding of humanism. But I am a weird outlier. So your viewers should not think that many humanists will agree with me on that.
I think what you say makes sense to me because I can imagine many religious people saying, yes, everybody has equal worth and dignity. We can use our faculty of reason to make progress. It's that faculty, ultimately comes from God, right? And it's also optimistic. Like we can make positive changes, right? We can create a more just society. I guess I don't see a necessary conflict between those two philosophies if we're talking about if those like three principles and tenets.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it gets complicated because once you dive into each of those three things, they're huge buckets, right? And you can dive into each bucket and start, asking, well, okay, what do we mean by reason exactly? What are the tools of reason? And what counts as a reasonable set of considerations that would lead us to hold a particular belief? And what would count as an unreasonable set of considerations? And once you get more specific, I mean, humanism has specific answers to those questions. So it wouldn't just be, yeah, sometimes you get the sense of people like, oh, yeah, I believe in reason. And then what they mean by reason is just totally unrecognizable to a humanist. Well, you have to work that out. But so there are real, genuine differences of view that a kind of very big picture approach like the one I presented can obscure. But I think that there can also be commonalities of fundamental values that too granular approach can miss. So I think that the challenge is to try and, I don't know, to define things like humanism in a clear way that draws clear boundaries as to what's in and out, but also a generous way. So you set where those boundaries are in an inclusive manner. That's what I would like to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. So do you think that this disagreement over, what reason specifically means is shown in some sort of, pro or anti-science approach to living life? Or do you think it
Well,
parallels that?
certainly, yeah. I mean, if you said, "Well, I'm not down with science," that would not be compatible with the humanistic understanding of reason.
Mm-hmm.
Not because humanists think that science is the only route to understanding. That's a common misconception. It's one sometimes, sadly, promoted by humanists themselves when they talk about how we come to understanding. But traditionally, humanism has always been open to a wide variety of tools that human beings use to make sense of our experience, including the arts and culture, including personal experience that is not scientifically validated in terms of, we don't usually do a test about our own personal experiences. But what I would go to philosophers like Dewey on this and think of science very broadly as a sort of epistemic approach, a communal epistemic approach in which we're all members of a community of inquiry trying to make sense of our experience, and we have responsibilities, epistemic responsibilities to each other. And it's not so much as about individual skepticism, but about the processes we use to make good sense of things so that we can come up with intellectual tools that help us solve our problems. If you think of science broadly like that, it's more than what happens in a lab. Or you can have a scientific approach to lots of areas of life where you say, well, I'm going to try this out and see what happens and be responsive to the results. So it's sort of a scalar idea of science where you get more or less scientific rather than just, is it science or is it not? And so you have that kind of generous approach to science, but it has to encapsulate a sense of epistemic responsibility, meaning if we want to do things that affect other people, we have to give reasons to those people as to why we should be allowed to do them. We have to be willing to engage in conversation about our deepest convictions. It's like this very democratic view. But yeah, rejecting science wholesale would not be consistent with humanism, simply because it's been so profoundly valuable in our pursuit of better understanding of the world.
So how does humanism relate to skepticism? Do you think that there is a pretty big overlap or a small overlap?
There is a big, well, it depends on exactly what you mean by that question. So certainly institutionally, a lot of the formal skeptical institutions have a lot of overlap with humanist institutions, and their memberships have a lot of overlap. So if you look in America, one of the major skeptical organizations would be something like Center for Inquiry, right? Which is a international organization that was set up some decades ago, and it promotes humanistic values broadly, and also has a big branch which does a lot of skeptical work. It used to do a lot of debunking of things like Bigfoot and stuff like that. I'm not sure if it does that anymore, but so institutionally there's a lot of overlap, and that's partly because humanists and the non-religious have basically always, until quite recently, been a minority in society, and their minority status is defined by disbelieving in things that other people believe in. That's how they're viewed, right? They're sort of people who reject the common consensus vis-a-vis religion, right? So that puts you automatically into a category where your skepticism of things other people believe becomes an important identifier. And so, yeah, I think there is overlap. And I think skepticism is good in again, a broad and generous sense of not believing everything you hear, checking your sources, trying to make sure you say true things and not nonsense. I mean, in a way, in this world of misinformation and fake news and deep fakes and all this stuff, skepticism has never been more important. We've seen the profound impacts of a lack of appropriate skepticism in things like the COVID denialism and conspiracy theories that are running rampant everywhere. So skepticism is really, really important. Again, going back to the idea of epistemic responsibility. We have a responsibility to be epistemically healthy ourselves in terms of having good beliefs and continually turning our beliefs over to make sure that they are actually warranted by the evidence. But also we have a sort of broader civic responsibility to promote a good public conversation around ideas that affect all of us. So that means not sharing misinformation, not sharing a meme that has a misquote or a misleading image and things like that. And one of the challenges we've got as a society right now is that many of the main platforms which give people information where people communicate have taken no epistemic responsibility. There's only very recently that things like Twitter will put up some sort of peer-reviewed sort of evaluation of a tweet where people will say, oh, a lot of people have said this is false and things like that. But before that, just anything goes. And I think that to too great an extent, it's still the case that it's becoming a breeding ground for conspiracy theories and fake news. And that's a disaster for society, deeply anti-humanistic. So definitely an overlap. The problem is that there's a subset, and I think it is a subset, of self-identified skeptics who view skepticism improperly. They've not understood the assignment, right? The idea is to generate better beliefs in order to promote this epistemic health in the hope that it will help us all live freer and with more dignity, right? Skepticism is a tool we use in order to improve our life conditions. It's not an end in itself, right? It's for something broader. And there's a sort of fetishization of a narrow form of skepticism that exists in the community, which basically consists of provocatively disbelieving in things
Mm-hmm.
on principle, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that has become a weird strand within the online atheist community in particular, of people who are now just straight up conspiracy theorists, right? They don't believe the government's accounts on really anything, right? And so you get
Yeah.
this really weird subset, and particularly if they're very politically charged issues. So I've been involved in a lot of LGBTQ activism in my time, seeing a massive assault on trans people, their rights, their dignity, their very existence as a category is being questioned. And there's a subset of atheists and skeptics who have really jumped on to the anti-trans bandwagon, and they feel like they're doing good skeptical work by criticizing what they view as a dogmatic gender ideology, and they're going to pierce it with their sort of rationality. But what they're actually doing when you look at the things is sharing all sorts of fake stories and made up crap from James Lindsay that just doesn't actually reflect what happens, and all these extremely right-wing websites and all this. So it's this weird ecosystem that defines itself partly by
Hmm.
its so-called skepticism, but is in fact it's metastasized into a form of conspiracy thinking. And that is really weird and depressing,
Hmm.
something we've seen over many years. And obviously that's not humanistic. Have to kick those people out.
Yeah, yeah. Have you ever heard of John McWhorter?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think he wrote a book where his main argument is that woke ideology has become basically kind of like a religion.
Yes.
I haven't read the book. I've watched an interview of him where he describes the message, I mean, my initial impression from like the interview was like, this guy does not think well of religion. Like he's already coming from the perspective that religion is, I guess, something more of a negative thing. And so he's now he's saying now this thing over here is like a religion in this sense. And I guess if you do think that it is somewhat of a religion and you are a part of some tradition that kind of likes to poke holes and debunk religions, I can kind of see some like why they would do that, right?
Yes. Yeah. I think you're right. And to be fair, I consider myself, I'm definitely would be considered by these people as part of sort of the wokerati, right? So I'm definitely in contemporary social justice culture, but I fully admit that people can express the concerns of that cultural movement in a very dogmatic way, and some of the behavior is dogmatic, right? There is a fragility about it in the sense of an inability to accept good faith questions and critique without pushing back very, very hard. The sort of ostracism of people who just disagree about things that they should really be able to disagree about. There's an unpleasant intensity to it sometimes that feels like a sort of cultish reaction to outsiders. And honestly, I think anyone who's been engaged in activism in social justice circles, so you will know, but your viewers might not know that I came to St. Louis, Missouri, where I used to live, to finish training and then serve as clergy for this humanist congregation. And I got there just before Mike Brown was killed. So I got there in June of 2014. Mike Brown was shot in August of 2014. And so my first year or two of being humanist clergy was really defined by the anti-racist uprising that happened in response to that shooting. I was very involved in interfaith activism with people of lots of different religions, trying to turn society's attention towards the deep systemic racism that still exists in American society, and of course in British society too, I should say. Now I'm back in Britain. And so I did a lot of activism with like the definition of woke, right? This is like the heart of woke culture for a while, was the surrounding areas of St. Louis, Missouri, and I was really deeply in it. And I think any one of us who was very involved in that would honestly say they saw behavior from fellow activists that was kind of that felt culty and overly intense and a bit religious. I actually think pretty much everyone accepts that. There's quite a lot of written critique of those elements of social justice culture coming from within it. Right? There's great essays online of people saying we shouldn't act like this towards each other and we should be better online or whatever. So I agree with some of the criticisms up to a point. I agree that there's an illiberal edge to some of the behavior of some social justice activists, including probably my own sometimes. The problem is when you use that to dismiss the concerns that are being raised by those movements, which are just empirically true. And this is something that I think a lot of anti-social justice atheists don't get, right? The idea that there are deep hierarchies of racism in the US, for instance, is an incredibly well-supported idea empirically. There is a huge amount of empirical evidence to justify that. For whatever you look at, whatever system or area of life, whether you look at health outcomes, whether you look at economics, whether you look at the justice system, whether you look at policing, whether you look at schools, how teachers treat kids differently. Like, you can look at just reams and reams of studies in every area of life to show that racism is real, that it still exists. It's not so much a matter of individual prejudice, but a matter of systemic injustice. And what really frustrates me is that people like Bookwater and others, they say, oh, these social justice activists are religious in the intensity of their commitment to dealing with this injustice. Therefore, the injustice is not real. And that doesn't follow, actually. It does not. That's just not a good argument, but that's what they do. I also think that they systematically overstate the problems within social justice culture and misrepresent a lot of the issues they're concerned about. I mean, there's organizations whose whole reason for existence is to basically surface some woke outrage. You know, they're like, oh, a professor in this university got fired for saying this innocuous thing, or a student in this university feels scared to say what they really think on this topic. And they write these articles, and you can guarantee when you read them, before you read them, you just read the headline, you see where it's coming from, you know that the stories are false, right? That there will be numerous errors of fact in them, and that they don't care. And that's what I find every time. I mean, I've never found one yet that was just a straight recounting. So you go into this article, I saw one recently about a professor who was fired, and it was apparently for having the wrong views on diversity, equality, and inclusion. And you go in and you find that they'd said a string of incredibly explicitly racist things to a student. And that got fired. It's like, well, actually, that's probably the reason, isn't it? Yeah. Like, but so there's so much dishonesty in the anti-woke argument that I think it's difficult for those of us on the social justice side to accept that there's some legitimacy in the criticisms, because then it feels like you're kind of opening the floodgates to the rest of the criticism. But I'm happy to say, yeah, there are problems with social justice culture. There's been problems with every social justice movement. They're just not as deep. And if I have to choose, and I feel like we kind of in a moment where we sort of have to choose, I'm going to be on that side because that's closer to my humanistic principles. That was a long answer.
Yeah, no, that was great. And even if it were the case that there were, those one student or even like some students who were uncomfortable with sharing contrary views on a college campus, for instance, that still doesn't mean that the cause that the social justice activists are fighting for is not a just one, right? It still does not follow. Like, okay, yes. Like, and it's unfortunate if some people don't feel comfortable sharing their differing viewpoints, but we can still acknowledge that the mission is just.
Yes, I think that's right. We have to be able to make that distinction, and I think we can also have some good philosophical grounds to ask: is it actually always bad that people come to feel uncomfortable about sharing certain political views? In fact, I don't think that is always bad, and I don't think anyone believes it's always bad. And well, maybe I shouldn't say that. There probably are like real free speech absolutists who say, well, if someone wants to go into the classroom and genuinely advocate for the reinstitution of slavery, that's fine. They should feel entirely comfortable doing that, and they should not feel any indication that they might suffer any social consequences for that, like people are not going to want to talk to them. But I don't think people really believe that. I think they believe that some political and deeply moral questions have become a closed issue, and that to raise them is actually uncivil, because to advocate for certain positions is to advocate for the demeanment of a certain group of people, and so you shouldn't do that. And I think that's fine. Like I actually think it's okay not to revisit the argument over slavery or the
Hmm.
Holocaust, right? I think it's fine to say no, in the classroom we're not going to discuss whether that might have been a moral good actually. And I think most people agree with me. It's just in the abstract they kind of forget that they're okay with some views not being expressible.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah, that actually makes me think of just this idea of moral relativism. So
Mm.
it's a topic that I briefly discuss in my classes. You know, I teach bioethics and human enhancement and stuff like that, and I touch upon it. And the example that I bring up for my students is something like female genital mutilation. Right?
Mhm.
I find that a lot of younger people tend to be more in favor of moral relativism. There's this concept of, well, like, well, we think it's wrong or we think it's right, and I can't speak for this other culture, right? Like they think it's wrong. They think so. So it's kind of like it's a wash. Like nobody has the objectively higher moral ground. And I try to, I don't share my views, but I use that FGM as an example just to kind of pump their intuition. So, oh, well, what do you think about that? I give them some statistics. These are how many girls and women who've like suffered this. Do you like what do you think that you can't say that it's objectively wrong, stuff like that. And a lot of times they don't want to say it. They don't want to say that it's
Yep.
objectively wrong. They really just bite the bullet.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I've experienced the same thing. When I used to teach educational programs back at my congregation, I would teach on ethics occasionally,
Hmm.
and I would teach about relativism, and we would explore the extent to which people agreed or disagreed with different moral statements, and then discuss why they agreed or not, and try and kind of push them in different ways to try and see where their real commitments were. And I found exactly the same thing in the sense that there were some issues, and it was specific issues, and I think we can explore why it was specific issues, where people would profess to effectively be moral relativists. But I always found that if you push them hard enough, they are not. I
Hmm.
never found anyone who really maintained that when you really push it by giving more and more examples, right?
Hmm.
A thoroughgoing moral relativism that would include something even more morally egregious than FGM or something. I just didn't find anyone who was willing to accept that. And what
Hmm.
I came to think was happening was that, in my view, people are not moral relativists.
Hmm.
But liberal people, progressively minded people, have got the idea that it is somehow culturally inappropriate to impose one's values on a
Yes.
different culture. And so they're responding to that by saying, oh, well, that's what they believe, but this is
Yes.
what I believe. But actually, they do think it's wrong. They're just
Hmm.
unwilling to say it. And I
Hmm.
think that that's unfortunate because I actually think it's perfectly fine to make moral judgments about the behaviors of particular religions, cultures, et cetera, across the board. I don't think that that should be a shield. We should do it sensitive to power dynamics and the peculiarities and contexts of where these practices come from. We shouldn't do it like in an ignorant and uninformed way. But we shouldn't say, oh, well, that's not for me to have a view on. And the people who, by the way, are loudest about that are people who come out of cultures which do egregious things to
Hmm.
people,
Hmm.
right? So you listen to victims of FGM, for
Yeah.
instance, who have
Yeah.
left those cultures. They're the loudest in saying, please say this is wrong, right?
Yeah.
They don't want people to be morally relativistic about this. And that's something that I find as well, working with people in the US mainly over the last 15 years and particularly university students in the US where I go to campuses and speak about issues about morality and ethics. One of the challenges is, I don't mean this in a disparaging way, it's just like the fact that I found was that many of them have never really been anywhere else and don't have a huge amount of relationships with people in other parts of the world.
Hmm.
And I've had the benefit through my activism, through my work in the international humanist movement, to actually work alongside and speak with people who live in Iran or Saudi Arabia or other parts of the world where there are very different moral regimes
Hmm.
and hear what they want to say about their own experience. And I'll tell you something really interesting that surprised me was that a lot of the most trenchant criticism of things like religiously based practices like FGM or came from people from the countries where those things were practiced. They were willing to use language about that I would never feel comfortable using in progressive social justice circles in America.
Hmm.
And it really, the first time I heard that, I was like, okay, I need to reassess my own assumptions about this and maybe be a bit more comfortable being an ally to those people who actually suffer the consequences of these sorts of
Hmm.
things. You see things like the many countries in the world where it's illegal to be an atheist. But people don't appreciate this because we don't often think about it. But actually, atheism is one of the most legally oppressed belief systems in the world, simply by the number of states which have legal prohibitions or sanctions for atheists and the extremity of what they do in some of those countries to atheists.
Wow.
One of the most oppressed religious groups in the world. And working with people in those countries, you do get a bit of a reminder that not everywhere is America or the United Kingdom, right? And that the political and cultural concerns there might be different, and that one has to balance one's reticence to speak about a culture that isn't yours with one's desire to support people who are subject to that culture and who are actually affected by it. And I think that that's a difficult balance, but I think sometimes, as with probably your students, people err on the side of not giving offense to someone else's
Yes.
culture when they should err on the side of making what I think is a pretty clear objective moral judgment in the case of FGM.
Yes. No, that makes perfect sense to me. I think for many people on the left, the last thing that you want to do is be intolerant. The last thing that you want
Yeah.
to do is have some sort of phobia and, be labeled as, some type of phobic. And that just kind of pushes you to not make strong statements about other cultural practices.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that to some degree that's appropriate because we
Hmm.
have had, I mean, hundreds of years, thousands of years of one culture often violently imposing itself on another culture,
Yeah.
trying to uproot its norms and practices and replace them with its own. And we don't want to do that. We don't want to be
Hmm.
part of that. But at the same time, we can't genuinely embrace moral relativism. I mean, the idea of the whole humanist concept of ameliorating the world so that human beings are able to live more free and fulfilled lives does not really make sense in the context of genuine moral relativism. And so I do think that it is at its heart it's a normative philosophy that doesn't really accept extreme relativism in morals.
Okay, that's a good segue for my next question, which is in regards to objective morality and not believing in God. So I know that many people who are secular will encounter this question from religious people. Like, how can you believe in objective morality? How can you believe that this is what objective progress for human beings looks like if you don't believe in God? What would you say in response to something like that?
I find it a very difficult question to answer because I don't think I accept any of the premises on which the question is based. And so I actually do. When people ask me that question, it takes me quite a long time to even get into the mindset whereby it makes sense to ask that question.
Hmm.
And that's not a dodge. It's like I'm trying to be genuine about how the question strikes me. I think basically everything about the assumptions underlying that question is wrong. So the analogy I like to use that I've been trying to develop in my own philosophical work for a while is to aesthetics, funnily enough.
Mm.
I did a fair amount of work in the philosophy of art. It's one of my passions. I think it's underappreciated area of philosophy. And I think we can make objective judgments about artworks, right? I think that we can look at an artwork like Hamlet or something and make a more or less objective judgment about, to answer major questions about that work, right? So if you're trying to interpret that play and someone comes to you and says, I really think that what is at the heart of Hamlet is the relationship between Hamlet and his dog, right? I think we can say, well, that's objectively wrong. And it's objectively wrong because you don't have a dog, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
It's not in the text. There's nothing. Whereas if someone says, oh, okay, well, what's really interesting about Hamlet is his relationship with his mother, which is Oedipal. So there's this weird sexual relationship with his mother, which is a theory that's been put forward. You can say, well, what's the evidence for that? And they go back to the text and they'd show you the lines and the quotes and the ways that they interact, they'd have evidence, right? And that evidence is objective in the sense that it's really there in the text. There's different texts, and we have to choose which one to use and all that complexity. But at least in some of the versions of Hamlet, there are some actual words spoken and actions done by characters that would enable you to mount an argument, right? And we still have a judgment to make as to whether we're convinced by the argument, but that's an epistemic judgment. It's based on things like, well, does this make good sense of the text as a whole? So how comprehensive is it as a theory? Is it obviously countermanded by other evidence in the text, right? If there's another scene that seems to work against that interpretation, that seems to be evidence against it. Is there just more obvious and fulsome themes that seem to be brought out more according to the evidence of the text itself and things like this? We can have a rational conversation about different interpretations of Hamlet or a piece of music or visual art, which is based on evidence, and we can make good epistemically defensible judgments as to, well, this interpretation strikes me as a really good interpretation for this set of reasons, which is based on this set of epistemic criteria, and we can judge them against each other. And I think that ethics is like that. That's what we're doing when we make an ethical judgment. We are looking at what we might call the moral features of a case, and we are mounting an argument in favor of a particular view or against a particular view. So there's been a lot of discussion in the UK about euthanasia recently for some reason. And so if we're talking about that, we are having an objective conversation in the same way, right? We are talking about features of human beings, about suffering, which is an objective fact, right? We're talking about longevity and what people can expect. We're talking about the effects of particular illnesses on people. We're talking about autonomy, which again it's not subjective in the sense that we can agree that people have a certain amount of autonomy and they can exercise in various ways. There are all these facts that we can point to that justify our arguments. And we are trying to compose ethical arguments that convince others in a similar way that we're trying to compose aesthetic arguments that convince others. And I just don't think that process requires anyone adjudicating, like above the discourse, to say that argument's right, that argument's wrong. And even if it did, I think they would have to give reasons along the same grounds, right? They would have to point to the same objective features that we have available to us in order to justify why they think one thing is right or wrong. So I don't think there's really a problem. I don't think it's very mysterious. I think part of the reason, I'll shut up after this because I know it's a big question. I think about it a lot. Part of the reason I don't think it's that mysterious is that there is a assumption underlying a lot of theistic thinking about this, I think, that human values require some sort of underpinning or sometimes called grounding, right?
Yeah.
We need something to make things like human flourishing ethically desirable. And I just think that is complete nonsense. I think that that gets it totally the wrong way round. Right? Our experiences of flourishing, health, our positively valenced experiences are what give us the language and framework to make judgments of good and bad, right? That's what we are talking about. That is the matter we are discussing. Morality in that sense is inherent to a universe in which there are people, which there are creatures such as us. It's just part of the picture that we're trying to understand. It is not something that requires its own explanation, like asking why good things are good. I think it's an alien way of thinking to me. I'm fundamentally a pragmatist in my philosophy. So I find it a completely weird question, and I find it difficult to even understand what it means. I don't know how satisfying that response would be to any.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot in there, and a lot of the same stuff that I've thought about as well. And again, I also have difficulty answering a question like that if it were posed to me, because I think part of what is appealing about religion is, in a sense, it's easier to know for them what is right and what is wrong, because it said so in the text, right? And it's not just human beings making stuff up because it comes from this all-powerful being. And whereas if I were to have a discussion with them and along the same lines, and I, talk about, I think morality oftentimes has to do with human well-being and human flourishing. I think they're intrinsically connected and stuff like that. And they were to
Yeah.
ask, they were
I
to
think that's
ask me,
exactly what it's about.
yeah,
Yeah, I don't think there's anything else it can really be about except other creatures, not
yeah.
just humans.
And they were to kind of question me on what I think human well-being is, and why do I think that is what it is, right? And then we can, depending on how deep they want to go, I might start talking about the different theories of well-being. Like, oh, hedonists think that the sole good is pleasure or something like that, right? And there's of course philosophers are going to debate over this, and I'm not sure if this debate is going to end anytime soon. It may continue on for thousands of years, like many other discussions in philosophy, right? And that might give the impression to the other person, it's like, well, then doesn't seem like you have any answers. It seems that what you've been saying is just debated amongst other philosophers, and you can't agree on anything. And because there is just these fundamental intuitions that you cannot justify, right? So if you can only talk about well-being, and that is your primary assumption, and you cannot give a metaphysical explanation for why these things are good for the person, right? Then your conversation just ends there. And this one philosopher has this basic intuition, and this other philosopher has some other basic intuition, and there's no arbiter of truth in that sense.
Yeah. So that last point I think is really key, right? What happens when, so if it's true that our moral judgments rest, if they're not reducible to intuitions, they rest on some sort of intuition about something like well-being, and people have different intuitions, then I kind of agree that we're kind of screwed there. In the sense that at the very least we're going to have some real problems. I don't actually think that should stop all moral reasoning, because I think we can have genuinely different intuitions about things but still reason away from our intuitions. We are capable of coming to a conclusion that's not consistent with our intuitions. But I actually don't think, I wouldn't want to say, it's a very complicated area, obviously, and it is one that has been debated for thousands of years, and it probably will continue to be debated. I don't think that should give us some sort of despair. It certainly doesn't give theists the win by default, right? Because their views have also been debated and critiqued for thousands of years, and they don't agree among themselves as to how to ground morality. And I personally think that theistic accounts of morality don't explain anything, right? In the sense of what I understand as an explanation would be an epistemic construct that enables you to do something with the framework you've created that you couldn't do before. And I've never met a theistic explanation of morality that enables me to actually meaningfully adjudicate a moral conflict in a way that was any different than how I would normally adjudicate it. So I don't think they do anything for us. But also I think that a lot of them have absurd conclusions. I mean, I think that the critique of atheistic morality, well, often there's the critique of basically, oh, you can't have any morality, any philosophically grounded morality, so it's nihilistic by default, or it's arbitrary and just what a culture says or whatever. There's a sort of relativistic view. And I think that there's a deep arbitrariness in some theistic accounts of morality, because ultimately they'll come down to God's commands or God's nature. And just like any other philosophical discussion, at some point you can always ask, well, why that? Why is that good? Why does that make it good? Why does that make it good? At some point you get a bedrock, and the theistic bedrock has a certain built-in arbitrariness to it that I find kind of offensive, whereas intellectually offensive. But I think the view that I really see it as the other way around. I think if we think of starting with moral problems, right? I want to extend the back of my house. Should I be allowed to do that, given the impact it will have on my neighbor's ability to sunbathe, right? Like, if we I don't know why that came up.
It's extremely specific.
Philosophers are really intriguing like this. Like, there's so much philosophy about tables, and I'm always like, well, that's because you're sitting at a table, isn't it? Like, you just seen it and like, consider the table. That if we start with problems, then ethics is something that is supposed to help us reason our way through the problems. So something that doesn't do that is just not useful to me. Like, and honestly, a lot of metaphysical exploration of ethics is not useful. Now, I'll distinguish that from meta-ethics, because often that is quite useful, right? Because when we do meta-ethics, we can ask, well, what ethical tools or frameworks should we be using in cases like this? And I really do think that things like utilitarianism or, Kantian idealism, things like that, these are different tools to approach the same matter, right? They're ways. It's continuous with science. It's science is a way of coming to understand an experience that we already, I don't want to say it's given, but you know what I mean? We have experiences, then we try and use science to understand those experiences. We get into weird philosophical ground when we try and use science to explain why we have experiences, to get underneath the experience. That's not what it's for. It's for making sense of the experience we have. And I think that morality is like that. Ethics is like that. We have ethical conflicts, things that we all recognize as ethical conflicts, and we need ethical tools to respond to those ethical conflicts. Trying to go underneath the conflicts, it's like, how does that help us solve it? If so, great. If it doesn't, I don't need to do that. I haven't worked this out into a very coherent philosophical system, but I think it is basically a pragmatist approach to ethics that I've just never felt that there's a good reason to ask questions about how to ground morality. I mean, there might be a fun way to explore this, because to really hone in on things like intuitions or properly basic beliefs, right? If we want to talk about something like a properly basic belief, my feeling is that the most basic thing is that it's ethically good to promote flourishing, right?
Yeah.
And that's actually, I think that's definitional, actually, in a way. I feel like it's impossible to doubt it. And so maybe we can just say we have to start from there and then work it out. Because can you make a sensible worldview in which, for instance, it would be ethically good to promote, and then you put in a word that's inherently normative in a positive direction, in a negative direction? It's just weird. It's just weird. Anyway, I feel like I'm talking a lot and not getting anywhere.
No, I appreciate that response. So relatedly, do you think that there's anything appealing about religion? Maybe not when it comes to ethics, but is there something appealing? What's attractive about it to you?
Yeah, so religion is a massive phenomenon, and it includes beliefs and practices and values and community, and in some cases it's intertwined with ethnic identity, and it's a huge thing. So I think it would be incredibly foolish to say, oh, get rid of that, right? Obviously, I take a naturalistic approach to religion. I think it's a human cultural product. I think actually it's blatantly a human cultural product. And when you look around the world and see the different religions they are and how they've grown out of particular cultural contexts and particular times, they're obviously all a product, very obviously a product of their time and cultural moment. I don't think any of them really transcend it well, they transcend it sometimes in the way that a great piece of music will transcend its particular cultural moment, or a great play or something, but they don't magically transcend it. They do the normal sort of transcendence that some cultural products are capable of, but in other ways are very, very clearly products of our culture. And if that's the case, and if many, if not most, human societies have had religion of some kind, then it makes sense to ask why. Why has that developed? What has that given us as a species? Why is it developed in so many different forms? Why does it keep coming back? Why do people keep creating new religions, returning to these forms of being and thinking? And I think that I don't want to go into sort of an evolutionary psychology of religion, but I do think that sociologically it's clear that there are benefits to certain types of religious practices. So some ritual practices have proven to be psychologically beneficial to people. Definitely the communities that religions often provide. Not all religions are built in a congregational model, but some are, and there's good sociological evidence. It's good for you to be part of a community like that. There is some evidence that being part of a community like that is morally ennobling, in the sense that it encourages people to get engaged more in civic pursuits, including politics, but also charitable work and other sorts of volunteerism. So I think there's actually good evidence that the sociological superstructure of religion is valuable. And that's one of the reasons why I went to lead a humanist congregation, because what the founder of the first ethical society wanted to do basically was preserve the sociological and ethical benefits of religion and make the metaphysics optional, in the sense that you could believe whatever metaphysics you wanted as long as you subscribe to the broad values. And although it's not the biggest movement in the world, it has persisted for 145 years. So it didn't appear and then go away immediately. It's something that some people have found very, very valuable, including, I think, many people who wouldn't be at home in any other sort of religious setting. And so that suggests to me that there is something in the argument that there is a social benefit to religious participation separate from religious beliefs. And I think that that's valuable. I also, I'm moved by the fact that many of the great activists for justice throughout history have been deeply religious people, and that they explicitly drawn on the narratives and the symbols of their tradition to work for justice and to do things that otherwise would be, requires a huge amount of bravery and puts them in extraordinary risk. I have to remember that a lot of non-religious people have also done that, including many explicit humanists who did the same out of an explicit commitment to humanism. So it's not unique to religion, but I do respect that moral passion. I mean, the clergy who I worked alongside in Ferguson and St. Louis are some of my idols for the incredible bravery they shown and the way that they wanted to live out their faith. So I think there are good things in religion.
Yeah. I share similar thoughts as well. I think there is a sense of community that human beings deeply want and desire, and I think this our social relationships are part of human flourishing, I would say. And I don't know if you got this impression, but a lot of the humanists that I've met who went to the Ethical Society, they were raised religious, but something bad happened and they kind of rejected it. And it's almost like they went to the Ethical Society to still seek out that structure and community, but just without the God part.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Like many of the members of that congregation were indeed sort of refugees from a religious upbringing or another religious background, who often it's partly because of the political association of religiosity with conservative politics, which is very strong in the United States. And so people, came into conflict with the political perspectives their churches or denominations were promoting, and they decided that they wanted to leave, but they still felt the desire for the community that it provided, or the sense of moral uplift, the challenge, or the connections. Yeah.
No, that's great, which is a perfect segue to my next question, which is humanism seems to be quite a liberal philosophy, a home for liberals. Do you think that there's room for conservatives?
So humanism is not a political theory, right? So its relationship to politics is kind of similar to a religion's relationship to politics, in the sense that there's this broad set of values that to be a humanist you really have to subscribe to. But the ways that values are instantiated in specific political positions, laws, policies, etc., can be different, but you can still claim allegiance to the value, right? So if we give a really simple example, we can say, well, we believe in free speech, right? That's great, that's good, and we can all be on the same side about that. But how you operationalize that can look very different among a group of people who all say they believe in free speech and all genuinely do believe in free speech. Some people might say, yeah, I believe in free speech, but hate crimes legislation should include certain really egregious hate speech. Some say, well, I do believe in free speech, but we need some limitations for basic safety or promoting terrorism, and some people say, no, there should be no limits at all. That's what it means. So how you interpret values, politics is sort of like the institutionalization of values. Cornel West said, justice is what love looks like in public. And I like to think that politics is what values look like in public, right? They're like the concretization and institutionalization of values. But that process is like a distillation, and it can happen in lots of different ways. So no surprise then that just like with any other tradition, there are many different political views within humanism. And it would be absurd to think that every humanist has to have exactly the same political views. Our basic moral values underdetermine our political approach. That said, they don't, it's not anything goes, right? There are clearly some political positions which are fundamentally incompatible with basic religious values, so basic humanist values. So you couldn't be a Nazi humanist, right? That's completely incoherent, because we've got this commitment to the equal dignity and worth of all human beings at the core of humanism. There's no reasonable way that you could argue that what the Nazis did and stand for fits with that fundamental value. So I think it's possible to say, no, that's you're excluded. So then the question becomes, if we accept that picture that I've just drawn, where do you draw the boundary, right? Because if we can exclude some and say, no, that's not a humanistic political philosophy, like, I think all forms of totalitarianism, right, fail under humanism, because they don't respect people's right to autonomy, to a say in how they live their lives. It doesn't respect their equal dignity, yada, 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 right? So we can draw boundaries, so that if we think of all the spectrum of political beliefs, and then we can draw, some of them are humanistic and some of them are not. And then the question is, where do we draw it? And does that exclude all conservatives or not? And I think the answer has to be no, of course, it can't possibly exclude all people who could potentially consider themselves conservative, right? If you think of one of my favorite political philosophers, Michael Oakeshott, is a British conservative philosopher, influenced a lot of my thinking on many topics. And if you were sort of a modern Oakeshottian conservative, right, you could lay claim to being a member of the conservative tradition and also say that you are a humanist. I think that that's totally compatible, right? But the problem is that how that word conservative is currently used, particularly in American discourse, and what the conservative political movement, self-described, actually looks like in the States, is nothing like that. It's got nothing to do with philosophical conservatism. It's actually a radical anti-government and increasingly neo-fascistic movement, right? So can you be a dyed-in-the-wool Trump supporter and be a humanist? No, no, because that political philosophy, it's too racist, it's too cavalier with it, doesn't care about the truth at all. Like, it's too aggressive, politically aggressive towards those who oppose it. It's too nationalistic, frankly. I mean, I think nationalism and humanism don't go together very well. It's not a political philosophy, Trumpism, that can fit, I think, with those fundamental values. And we can specify why, right? You look at things like the Muslim ban. Is that consistent with treating everyone with equal dignity and worth? Obviously not, right? I would say obviously not. Or look at how he mocked and derided his political opponents and continues to do so. Is that consistent? No, it's not. And that's indicative. It's not just his own personal behavior. It's part of the sort of political brand, right? That's what that politics kind of stands for, is that sort of meanness, that sort of aggressive unpleasantness towards people who disagree. And is that humanistic? No, I don't think it can be. And this came up, we had Trump supporters at the Ethical Society of St. Louis, a few, small handful, and they would get very upset to feel like they were out of the circle. But at a certain point, you just have to say, no, this is what this organization stands for. This is what this tradition stands for. You've chosen to support a political movement that is not reasonably compatible with those fundamental values. So you've stepped outside. You've decided that you're not fully part of this community anymore because of what you've chosen to believe and how you've chosen to use your vote. And that's not, we shouldn't compromise our values as a community to include you, right? You need to reflect on why you've gone down this dark political path. And I think that much of American conservatism today is in that place. I mean, if you look at the actual people who are elected, so St. Louis is in Missouri, that's where the congregation was, right? That's where it still is if they haven't moved it since I last visited. And Missouri is a state represented by some really unpleasant people who are doing very unpleasant things politically. So think of Josh Hawley, who's a senator in Missouri, he's a chief election denier and supporter of the Capitol riots. None of that is compatible with humanism. And so I think it's very difficult to be a humanist conservative nowadays because of what conservatism has become. And that's an indictment on conservatism. That is not an indictment of humanism.
Yeah, it's certainly the case that when I use the term conservative, I am speaking from like the American perspective and the American context. And when I think of generally what values conservatives have and what positions they take on certain political issues, they don't seem to be very consistent and compatible with humanism. For instance, like
No.
being anti-gay marriage, right?
Yeah. It's
And
just
it's
not
like,
consistent.
in regards to the future of humanism, more and more people are becoming secular, and especially when the younger you are. Do you think that that is a good opportunity for humanism to grow as an alternative to traditional religion?
It's an opportunity, but it's not a guarantee.
Mm-hmm.
So the US and the UK definitely are becoming less religious. All the data shows that there's been a dramatic decrease in the number of people who identify as religious, more dramatic in America because the starting point was higher. The demographic change has been extremely quick in terms of religious identification. And there are almost certainly many more people who will say they're religious in the United States than who actually are religious. And there are many, many more people who say they're religious in the States than who practice a religion in any meaningful sense. And that's true in basically every country. So this is an opportunity for humanism to grow as a movement. I don't think generally it's actually achieving that. And it's really interesting to ask why. There's sometimes the assumption, I think it was the assumption during the New Atheist era, that our movement would grow simply by virtue of there being more non-religious people. But that hasn't proven to be the case. There was an influx of a lot of people who were very excited about the New Atheists. That was a genuine kind of banner period for organized atheism in America and in the UK. Like people came out in their hundreds to see these people speak, and it was a huge deal. And it was a lot of energy. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think 9/11 is a major cultural moment where a particular sort of critique of religion / Islam became very exciting to a particular group of people. And the movement kind of rode that wave for a while, but that crested a long time ago, and the movement has fragmented a lot since then. So you now see people like Richard Dawkins, who were once, doyens of organized atheism, increasingly drawn towards the intellectual dark web and anti-trans stuff and just weird. They're not fringe views, sadly, but what I consider like weird anti-social justice positioning. So you increasingly see that generation of prominent atheists defining themselves against contemporary social justice culture instead of for a positive, progressive, humanistic view of the world. And so that has split things, and that's made it more difficult for organizations to grow. But it is, what I personally think that what I've been calling contemporary social justice culture, wokeism or whatever it is, I actually think that at its best, that is humanistic. I think that is a broadly, because it's not really expressed in the language of a traditional religion. It is about trying to ensure that the world treats marginalized groups equally and with full dignity. And I would say, although I know this is counter to the characterization that often gets online and on Twitter particularly, I would say that it is based in a realistic, reasonable understanding of human beings and human culture. Like I would genuinely say that the analysis offered by woke culture of structural inequality that's embedded in societies that think of themselves as very liberal and egalitarian is true. It's just empirically true. And that one of the reasons why people are so against it is because that's true. Because I think people know fundamentally that there is a lot of structural injustice that affects people's lives profoundly. And so I actually think that it is a humanistic movement in that sense. Just a lot of these people would never think of themselves as humanists, but that's always been the case. There's always been more people who broadly hold humanistic values than who self-identify as humanists and join a humanist organization. I don't know why that is, but I think that is and has always been true.
Yeah, so that I think that actually ties nicely to what you said earlier about, regarding my question about people who rejected their religious upbringing and ended up joining some sort of humanist congregation as a response. And you were saying, well, oftentimes there's a political affiliation with these religions, and it's their conflict with the political affiliations that made them them leave their religion. And that makes me think of maybe the flip side of that. Perhaps you do have these younger generations of people who are secular, but they, in terms of values, they tend to lean more conservative. And so it's a liberal political affiliation of humanist congregations that pushes them away.
Yeah, that's an interesting question as to whether that happens. I mean, there aren't that many. There's so few humanistic congregations that I doubt that's having a big cultural impact. Like there's 24 ethical societies in America, so there are more Christian churches in St. Louis than there are ethical societies in America. So I'm not sure how much of an effect that has. What I have seen, I mean, there's definitely a phenomenon of people, particularly young people, some young people, feeling burned by and turned off by wokeism, right? They say the wrong thing on Twitter and they get piled on, and then they're like, well, screw these people. I'm going to become the worst version of myself. And those people are obviously, they're responsible for their own choices and behaviors. It happens to famous people too. I mean, look at the trajectories of all these intellectual dark web figures, right? They start off not as bad as they have become. Right? Someone like a James Lindsay or Peter Boghossian, I'm not sure if any of your viewers will know, but it's just YouTube. They'll know who these people are. So they were not as bad when I knew about their work when they were sort of doing atheist writing some years ago than they are now. And they've been sort of radicalized by partly the response to what they've been saying. And I think that there's two things at least operating to push people away from what I think of as a humanistic approach to these issues. One of them being this sense of, oh, well, if I'm going to get yelled at on the internet for saying my mind, then I'm going to join these people who let me speak my mind, whatever it is. So
they're seeking community.
Right. And they got excommunicated, right? And so they're going to find the people who will welcome them. And that does happen. And we have to be honest that does happen. It does happen. I've seen it again and again. So it definitely happens. And they're still responsible for their choices. It doesn't make us at fault for what they do, but it's still a dynamic that exists. But the second thing that happens is that they then discover that there's a huge market in being anti-woke, right? There's a huge attention market for that. And you can be, like I'm just thinking of some people from the UK, you can be a not very successful academic and suddenly write a book about a hot topic and take an anti-social justice view and become a sensation. And you can be a not very successful actor, right? And then go on a rant about how white privilege isn't real and get a massive Twitter following, right? And you can parlay that. And you can see over time how people realize, oh, this is what gets the engagement. The more outrageous I am, the more engagement it gets. And that's very intoxicating. Like I have no Twitter followers basically, but I felt that even sometimes I'm like, oh, if I said this meaner, more people will share it. And then you have to kind of pull yourself back and say, yeah, but is that who I want to be? And you say, no, it's not who I want to be. But there are all these perverse incentives in particularly the social media space that do drive people away from the sort of broad, generous, inclusive humanism that I would like to see people embody. Like a more kind of, it's almost more relaxed, where you're intensely committed to your values, but not brittle about it. I think that's where I'd like to get to.
No, well said. I think that a lot of the consequences, I guess, of what people believe and like the shifts of where they align politically has to do with the other side with whom they interact. And it seems like to me that the extremists tend to be the loudest. So if you have somebody who is maybe says something controversial and the extremists on the other side take extreme measures and say extreme things to criticize that person then gets pushed towards the other side because, oh, they're nuts, they're crazy. I'm not going to affiliate myself with them anymore. And I can honestly see that when it comes to religion, right? Like sometimes I'll see clips of religious leaders say outrageous things, just utterly outrageous. And that does not make me sympathetic to what you believe. That tells me that you and I are opposed on these very important issues, right? And so like I would never go to that person's church, you know?
No, right. And they don't want you. I mean, that's
Yeah.
I think that's the thing, in the sense that what they recognize that they'll get two things out of that. They'll get the people who silently agree with them will be like, yeah, someone speaking the truth that I want to say, but I'm not brave enough to say because I'll get canceled. I love that person. I'm going to follow them. I'm going to retweet the stuff and everything. And then they get our reaction, which is like, oh my God, what a terrible thing to say.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll find myself tweeting at them, what a terrible thing to say. And then I'm boosting their engagement, right? And that's, Twitter does that on purpose. It puts
Mm-hmm.
things that it knows you will hate. I've seen it more and more the more I've spent time on the platform, because
Mm-hmm.
you engage. And so I don't want to get into a whole like almost Luddite thing about social media. But I think that it is interesting in our political environment right now that the level of intensity is so high, understandably, because there are lots of threats to marginalized communities right now. And it feels scary. I'm back in the UK. It's generally a much more liberal country than the United States, but there are significant flashpoints, one over trans people particularly, and there's been some ridiculous protests outside drag queen story hours at local libraries here in the United Kingdom, which is just baffling to me. But it's happening in some places. And you look at that and think, oh, this is actually quite scary. Like, a bunch of literal neo-Nazis turned up outside a drag queen story hour in London. I think it was earlier this week or last week. And it's like, what is happening to the world where 5 or 10 years ago that would never have happened? They would have had a drag queen in a library or whatever. It would never have been an issue. And so it is scary, but I guess that what I come back to in terms of like thinking about this from a humanistic lens is firstly holding really hard to the fact that everyone involved in this is a human being with equal worth and dignity.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that we don't politically oppose what is abhorrent and evil, but we oppose it recognizing that the people who are promoting what is abhorrent and evil are human beings like us.
Mm-hmm.
And that changes the tenor of how you can approach these things. And then secondly, just trying to ensure, and this is just my personal approach, I'm not saying that everyone has to have it, but trying to ensure that in my work to make the sort of society I want to live in, I don't become the sort of person I don't want to live with.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be very difficult in a very polarized environment, but that's what I want to try and do.
Yeah, that sounds like a very worthy mission. What do you think it would take for humanist congregations to grow?
Yeah, I tried to do that for years as my actual job. What would it take? Well, I think the main thing, and this will have to be the last question, I'm afraid, because I have to write an article that I haven't finished yet. I think the main thing, honestly, is to improve the quality of the product. And I know that sounds very clinical, but I think there's a tendency within the very small circles of people who create analogs of religious community for non-religious people to think that people don't come because of some sort of philosophical problem or even because of like marketing, right? Because too few people know that it exists. People think that that's the problem. Or we describe ourselves using the wrong words. So should we say humanist? Should we say atheist? Lots of very heated debates about that. And I don't think that's the fundamental problem. I think the fundamental problem is too often the product is bad. So that when people come, they don't have a good time, right? Either they listen to a boring speaker, or it's not a contemporary experience with contemporary music and beautiful space, and like that it just doesn't fit their expectations of what a modern community event should be. And one of the things I tried really hard to do in St. Louis was to consistently raise the quality of the experience that we were giving people, so that we hopefully became more careful about choosing speakers who could really engage people emotionally rather than just give a lecture, which is a great thing. I love lectures, but that's not what it is. It's a different skill. And making sure the music was exceptional and trying to link the music to the message in some meaningful way to create an aesthetic whole and redo the lighting system and And I actually think that that's all incredibly important. And you have to go through all that as a whole. Also look at things like, how are people welcomed when they arrive?
Mm.
Are they engaged in interesting conversation? Are your members actually welcoming to other people? Are they going out of their way to bring people into the community? That's actually the thing, the kind of meat and potatoes of it is more important than how you brand it and how you
Hmm.
market it. It is
Hmm.
important, other stuff. But when people come, they have to have an exquisite experience and they have to be asked to come back. And too many of our ethical societies are not actually hitting that mark every week.
See. Okay. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It was
It's been a
a
pleasure.
great,
It's
great
great to catch up.
discussion. Yeah. Do you want to tell people about any current projects you're working on?
Since I joined the University of Sussex as their new chaplain, I have not been working enormously on many other projects that I can announce. I've just got my feet under the desk and then trying to still kind of move back to the UK and feel comfortable there. So I'm trying to take it a little bit more slowly. But if people do want to find out about what I am doing, they can go to my website, which is croftspeaks.org, or you can find me on all the social networks with @Croft Speaks.
All right, wonderful. I'll make sure to add that to the description as well.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I hope you have a nice day.
Yep, it's been a pleasure.